So in other words, relative to the rest of the world, after all of these massacres and after all of these slaughters and incarcerations that I'm telling you about, Cuba healthcare has worsened. And as any Cuban American in this room and any that you'll meet will tell you, if Cuban healthcare was so fantastic, why is it that our relatives in Cuba clamor whenever we get in touch with them for us to send them aspirin? Why is it that they reuse hypodermic needles in hospitals, folks? It is an absolute scandal. We see, look, Michael Moore is no dummy. No one is going to convince me that he really thinks that what he saw on that Potemkin tour of Cuba is what the average Cuban gets in healthcare. I would invite you to visit a website called The Real Cuba, where they have pictures smuggled out of Cuba about what a hospital looks like, that Joe six-pack Cuban, not that average Cuban can afford a six-pack on $12 a month salary, where he is forced to go to. It is an absolute joke. Cuban healthcare has worsened. And then it's interesting because in the movie Sicko that you will see, you know what's going to happen in the press when that movie comes out. Oh, it's wonderful, everything. Michael Moore interviews Che Guevara's daughter, Aleida, who is an MD in Cuba, a doctor. And she says, and so naturally they're at a clinic. Michael Moore is being shown through a clinic, one of the clinics that is made available to the communist hierarchy, all right? And Aleida is going, well, whatever shortages we have for the people are because of the U.S. blockade, who are starving our people and making these folks, if you get nothing else out of my little message here, there is no U.S. embargo of Cuba, much less a blockade. It was hysterical 2 weeks ago to watch NBC's Today Show broadcasting from Cuba. Did anybody see that? Joke? Okay. Matt Lauer is sitting there, Matt Lauer and Andrea Mitchell, talking from Havana, Cuba. The backdrop, by the way, the backdrop in Havana was La Cabaña Fortress, where most of the massacres were hundreds of men and boys were being slaughtered without trial by firing squad every week. Nary a mention of that from the NBC's Today Show. But it was interesting because Cuba's propaganda ministry announced exactly 3 weeks ago that they were going to start launching a big campaign to boost tourism to the island. They were going to start refurbishing all the tourist facilities such as they are in Cuba. Lo and behold, 2 weeks later, for some odd reason, NBC saw fit to broadcast from Havana while Matt Lauer was sitting there on camera advising American tourists on how to visit Cuba legally. Isn't that interesting? And here's the funny part. He is sitting there, Matt Lauer and Andrea Mitchell sitting there decrying the U.S. blockade. They go so far as to ape the Cuban regime's terminology. Blockade of Cuba. What do you think? You think battleships surrounding it, nothing can enter. In the process of them denouncing this blockade, the backdrop to Matt and Andrea are tourists from all over the world, including the United States of America, holding up signs and waving, Milwaukee, Iowa, Jacksonville, and so forth. I cannot be the only person who found that funny. You hate to laugh at this stuff, but it shows the absolute stupidity that passes for reporting in this country when it comes to Cuba. So there is no embargo of Cuba. Today, as I speak, the United States is Cuba's 5th biggest food supplier. No, biggest food supplier overall and 4th biggest trading partner. The United States does more trading with Cuba than does Canada, who doesn't have an embargo. There is no embargo. And medicine was never part of an embargo from 1962 on. Because the embargo was completely diluted, so-called embargo, in 1974 when at Henry Kissinger's suggestion, we allowed subsidiaries of U.S. corporations to trade with Cuba. But even then, even before that, medicine was never part of it. But here we have Che Guevara's daughter telling Michael Moore that it's the U.S. blockade that makes medical care, in those few instances when it's inadequate for the people, it's the U.S. blockade. And I will guarantee you that it will not be challenged by any media organ. I will guarantee you that you will never see anybody take, Michael, that's a pile of BS, buddy. Medicine was never part of that. You will never see that, and I can guarantee it to you. Because the BS has continued steadily. When I read the obituaries to Vilma Espin, Vilma Espin was Raul Castro's wife, okay? And she was considered Cuba's first lady, okay? She passed away last week, and she was considered the most powerful woman in Cuba. She was the head of the Cuban Federation of Women. It's a Stalinist propaganda organization. When I read the obituaries, you can read the Washington Times, you can read the New York Times, and you can read Time magazine. What was she? First of all, what regime was she an officer in? The regime that we're talking about here, co-founded by this fascinating gentleman, incarcerated more people as a percentage of population than Joe Stalin's regime. At one point in Cuba, 350,000 people were jailed in various prison camps. This is out of a population of 6.4 million in 1960. According to the Freedom House, Human Rights Group Freedom House, 500,000, 500,000 Cubans have passed through the various prison camps, forced labor camps, and political prisons in Cuba. According to Anne Applebaum's book about the Gulag, at any one time there were about 2 million Russians incarcerated in the Soviet Gulag. That's out of a population of about 230 million people. Put your calculator to it, and you will see that this regime, co-founded by this man, regarded as a liberator and an anti-imperialist, actually incarcerated more people than Stalin's regime. This regime, co-founded by this man, executed in absolute numbers more people in their first 3 years in power than Hitler's regime executed in his first 6 years in power. This regime drove out 20% of the population from a country. Well, so a lot of people, especially from this part of the country, well, so what, world? Latin Americans are always trying to sneak out of their countries and get in the U.S. So what makes y'all different? I will tell you what makes us different. Prior to the regime co-founded with this people, that did not happen. Not only did it not happen, Cuba, in the 20th century, prior to the fascinating regime set up by these guys, took in more immigrants, primarily from Europe, on a per capita basis than did the United States, including the Ellis Islanders. People used to be as desperate to enter Cuba as they are now to exit Cuba. At a time in the 1950s and in the 40s, when any Cuban could get a U.S. embassy visa for the asking, any Cuban come to the U.S. At that time, more Americans lived in Cuba than Cubans lived in the United States. I ask you to consider that. There's no other Latin American country, probably no other country in the world that can make that claim, because it was a country that had, as I say, a higher per capita income than half of Europe. So this regime drove out 20% of the population of that country. And by the way, that is a small proportion of the people who wanted to leave. Don't think that everybody wanted to leave left. Why would people jump on rafts? Start right now in the black market in Cuba. The two hottest items were styrofoam in order to build a raft, and ping pong paddles in order to paddle away. Why do people risk being ripped apart by tiger sharks from a regime, as I said, that previously had more Americans living in it than Cubans living in the U.S.? Like I say, I'll keep going back to Alice in Wonderland. What we hear in the media is the exact opposite of the truth. So what happens? This most powerful woman in charge of that regime dies. What do we get from the Washington Post? What do we get from the New York Times? What do we get from Time magazine?